Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, director at the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Verde, for the third podcast of our Reading for Life program. Reading for Life is a movement of the imagination for the purpose of growing community around a shared love of literature. Structured like a book group, but one facilitated to maintain the richest possible dialogue among the participants and the source text, the presentations bridge great novels to dedicated readers. The idea is that the real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources, if any, are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. Our unofficial tagline for the program is 8 podcasts, 4 books, and you. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee was our first book, and we've had wonderful discussions about Jem, Scout, Dill, and Boo. So now we're ready to move on to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. But before we dive into that, Michael, could you talk a little bit more about how you get there in these readings? What's come up time and time again is the people who have been in the lectures and the discussions are so interested in how you read these books, but they can be kind of confused as to how you get there. So can we talk a little bit about how you read intentionally and get to where you go with these books?
Yeah, that's fun stuff for me. And here's if a reader can get what I'm about to say, it will transform their relationship to novels. Let's just leave it in that genre. But it's true for any hypothetical verbal structure. If they are reading works of fiction, if this concept can be communicated, it's a game changer. So here it goes. We typically think that what words mean has something to do with what the word corresponds with or corresponds to outside of the book. This is how we read the newspaper. If we read a story, if it's a true report, then the description about a car wreck last Friday on such and such corner, that is true if last week on such and such corner. In other words, we're reading through the words to something that's taking place in the quote unquote real world. Okay, and that's how we read most everything. If you read a work of history, what makes it true is that what the words are describing corresponds with events that took place in the empirical world. So we can call that reading as correspondence, or the validity of what I'm reading is predicated on these words corresponding with what in fact are not words. You know, things that happen in what we call real life. It's not just verbal. Okay, that if a person reads a work of fiction in that way, the reader will lose about 99% ultimately of the power of the verbal structure, because you have to know that writers, you imagine someone who creates music for a concert music. If someone went to participate in the symphony and the whole time was trying to relate to the music on the basis of what it corresponded with outside of music, like, is this really what it was like in 1834 in Vienna? Well, if a person's sitting there imagining that they're listening to the music, doing that kind of a game in their imagination, they're missing the music. They're not participating in the musical form. The music itself is the work of art, not what it corresponds to outside of it. That's easy to see with music because music is not representational.
I was gonna say that's a great way to explain it from the music perspective. Sure. And
same thing with paintings. At a certain point, you know, there's Marguerite has a painting, Saint Pas un pipe. This is not a pipe. And what he's saying is it looks like a pipe, but this is a painting. It's not a pipe. Okay. We can sort of see that with painting. It's harder because painting, you can see, starts to move towards representation. Well, if we imagine that words are not representing something outside of the words, but are communicating meaning nevertheless on the basis of the way the words are cohering with one another. In other words, it's not how these words are pointing to something off the page. It's how these words are coming together on the page. And if and in order for this to be the reading experience to be of consequence, is that what the form of those words, when they come together, that form has to be communicated to the reader's imagination. You see, when we read through the words to what's off the page, we're missing the form. We're missing the figure. Just like if you're listening to music but not paying attention to the musicality, you're not participating in the form of the music at all. I mean, your imagination might be. Okay, so all of this here's the important concept of the switch. If you go from reading to imagine what these words correspond to off the page, okay, and transform to the idea that what these words mean has to do with the way they resonate and relate to each other, the way they come together to create a form, a figure. In other words, it's as if these words are trying to come together and assume something like a sculpture or music combined. They're trying to come together to almost create something that's in a fourth dimension, but they can never achieve that ultimate creative manifestation if the reader is just not paying attention to the words and listening to the words as they communicate as words. You know, if you're a sculptor and you work with pottery, or you want to make pottery, you know that the clay gets a big word edgewise into what the final product is, because clay is going to integrate with clay and form ways based on the reality of clay. Well, there's a dimension in which words are just like that. You're not going to make them do things that they don't have a spirit for doing any more than you're going to make that clay assume shapes that it cannot maintain in its own integrity as what it is. Well, words are a reality. So that's what, if you want to participate in the reality of these words, you have to understand that they're real as words, not only as pointers to things that aren't words. Now, that was a roundabout way of making the point here, but the point is that words have a reality that is verbal. Okay, we understand this with numbers. We understand that numbers constitute an entire numerical universe, okay? And that if you work with these numbers, you can't make them if they're going to be equals, if the signs are going to be equal, if you're going to do things generative and mathematically, then you have to recognize that numbers have an intelligence. They have an order. You can participate in that order, okay? And you can apply mathematics. That's why they make a distinction between pure mathematics and applied mathematics. You can apply this math to the physical world, but these numbers have a reality without the physical world participating in them. So and that's true for nature. Nature has a reality that, words have a reality like numbers analogously, and they have a reality like nature. This is a verbal world. It is a real, so if we think of numbers as an analogy, it starts to, I think, make better sense that you have to start to participate in the way these words are meaning and the reality of their meaning as words, as structures of language. If you start to read a book in that way, you have a much greater chance of consciously participating and what those words are attempting to become, and can only become through your imagination.
Okay, so can you give us an example? Like, can we start with Jane Eyre, and can you can you pick something like that and give us an idea of how that looks in Jane Eyre?
Right, sure. So an important image for Jane, or images throughout the novel, are images of fire. So you can think of that Rochester is ubiquitously associated with fire. It's not, he's either appearing at a fireplace, or he has the kind of fiery passion, or Bertha Mason burns up in his house. So you can think of Rochester as associated with fire. And you can think of characters, conversely, that are associated with ice. So Mr. Brocklehurst at Lowood is, because he's in absence of feeling, he's this sort of rigid pillar of moral self-righteousness that has no empathetic relationship to any of the students. Okay, so that would be the opposite of passion. So you can think of then you can think of St. John Rivers, or St. John Rivers, who is also opposite of Rochester, because he too lacks feeling. He calls himself a Greek philosopher. He's a theologian, of course, but he thinks of himself as a philosophically related to the Bible. He is associated with ice. In fact, Jane talks about how he's freezing her out of the. Okay, so if you begin to participate in these images of fire and ice, you can begin to see that they're organizing principles of the novel. In fact, every character of any consequence in the novel is either an ice character or a fire character, with the exception of the characters that blend those two things. And by ice and fire, again, we're talking about intellect and passion. So ice with intellect and fire with passion, or we're talking about intellect and feeling, okay? If you can blend those two things, in other words, if your intellect and your feeling can come together in a way that is fertile, then each is made greater by the other. You're more intelligent for incorporating feeling. Okay, my point, based on your question, can I give you a concrete example? All of these dimensions of Jane Eyre will fly right past your conscious awareness if you're not paying attention to the way these words are trying to form a structure. In this case, a structure that gives you insight into all these different characters and why it is that Jane might have to, and in fact, most every instance does have to, resist that character's initiative to, in some ways, be her master. In other words, at Gateshead, where the novel starts, she's an orphan with the Reed family, okay? And Miss Reed throws her into the red room, and she has such a fright that she says that she was, well, first of all, she says, I resisted all the way. This is a critical sentence, okay? Miss Reed is going to throw her into the red room. She resists all the way. It's an important sentence because this is what Jane Eyre does throughout the entire novel. She resists all the way. It's not just Miss Reed she's going to resist. She's going to resist Mr. Brocklehurst. She's going to even resist Helen Burns in a way. She's going to resist St. John Rivers. She's going to resist Rochester. And what is she resisting? Each time, those are people who are going to define her. But the second thing she says when she's in the red room is she has such a fright that she fell out of myself. That really herself has come out of her body. The rest of the novel, she's trying to, in a sense, find her other half, what would complete her. But in order to arrive at the one that will rightfully complete her, she has to resist all the ones that would not complete her in a fulfilling way. Okay, if you're not participating in the ice and fire imagery, you would miss out on what this resisting all the way has to do with. You see, you wouldn't understand that she's resisting because that person doesn't have the right integration of intellect and passion. The first time she meets Rochester, he's all passion, but not enough intellect because he's been incontinent sexually. He's just been taking advantage of people. In other words, his passion has overcome his judgment. Okay, so she has to resist him then. You wouldn't understand why it is, perhaps, that she ultimately resists Rochester if you don't understand the subtext that she's trying to get the ice and fire right so that they come together to be what? And in this case, what they come together is to be fertile or green, which is invariably symbolized through marriage. In other words, if you marry your intellect and your passion, then you are in a place emotionally and intellectually where you can marry another person. And you can marry them in a way that will fulfill both of you because you are integrating your intellect with your passion. If one of those two things were out of sync, then you would marry wrongly. You would be connected to someone and they would consume you or you would consume them. You see, two would become one by one disappearing. But if two are going to become one in such a way that both are fulfilled, then they're going to have to combine their judgment with their passion. All of this dimension of the novel, which I find remarkably interesting on multiple levels, depends upon the reader being aware of the way these words are connecting with each other to form patterns. If you're oblivious, if you're reading right through the words and saying, oh, this must have been like in 1842 for a governess, there's nothing wrong with that. But you're going to be missing 9/10 of what's going on with the verbal form the way you would with the concert music.
Yeah, so we had talked about that a little bit with the To Kill a Mockingbird, that each word is specifically chosen. So as you're reading, paying attention, and if you have that moment where you're like, well, that word sticks out, why does that stick out? And kind of not just going through that, but you know, and
go ahead. Not only is each word important, here's a simple rule of hermeneutics, which is a fancy word for interpretation. The part and the whole. Okay, the parts mean according to how they come together in a whole, and the whole means only through the parts. So in hermeneutics means you're getting in the part and the wholes to be in communication with each other. So not only do all these words are meaningful, they're meaningful as parts of the whole. And you have to start to get a insight into the whole to appreciate the parts, but you can never get insight into the whole if you're not paying attention to the parts. So the wedding of parts and whole is part of what we're talking about, but the parts and wholes we're talking about now are made of words.
It's also why you say it's important to read the book more than once.
Absolutely. I say to myself straight up, until you've read a book 3 times, you haven't read it once. Because really, at first, your imagination's following the plot, which is great. Right. Except that is very, very superficial. You know, T.S. Eliot said the plot is like the bone that a burglar throws to the dog to keep the dog occupied while he's robbing the house. Okay, so the plot is just sort of tricking us into being interested. Where the real story is taking place is actually between the words. It is a verbal reality where the deal is going down. And until you've gotten past the following the plot into participating in that, then you probably have really just a superficial grasp of the story.
I like that. I like that analogy. I haven't heard that before.
I mean, yeah, that's a great one. Because it makes sense too. Imagine if you met someone for lunch for 90 minutes once, and then you walked away and you fantasized that you totally understood that person. I mean, these are the most potentially complex imaginative structures in the universe, at least within this genre. And to think that I'm going to sit down once and completely have absorbed all of the life and intelligence and imagination that went into its creation, that is actually fairly arrogant.
Okay, so that's one excellent one. The fire and the ice, it, you know, kind of with that intellect and feeling. And as I'm thumbing through my book here, I can see several things, but I don't want to get too detailed because we're hoping that people haven't read maybe all the way through it just yet. But so is there another theme? The fire and ice is a huge one. What's another one that we can kind of, as we're reading through it, either it's the first time or the second time or the third time, that we can be watching for?
You might notice that Ferndeen is a very interesting place. So Ferndeen, Jane moves from Gateshead to Lowood to Thornfield to Moore's House and to Ferndeen. These are the different settings in which Jane moves through this, what's called a Bildungsroman, or a novel about one's education, or the story of one's education. Okay. So what starts at Gateshead ends at this place called Ferndeen. But the way Jane arrives there is really, really interesting because she hears out of nowhere, at the depths really of her low point, she's on the brink of starvation, really, having fled Thornfield as a governess with no source of income, okay, because she's she resisted all the way, right? And she resisted. Mr. Rochester could have solved all of her financial worries. She could have been a high status in society. She would have had potentially all the income she would have needed. Okay. She resisted all that because she wouldn't have been Jane Eyre. So that's that's interesting. Okay. But anyway, because she did do that, now she's on the brink of starvation. She didn't have a place to live and she didn't have any sustenance. When she thinks that it's about over with, all of a sudden out of nowhere, she hears a voice saying, Jane, Jane, Jane. Now, it turns out this is the voice of Rochester, who's no longer at Thornfield, but he's in a place called Ferndeen. But we learned that Ferndeen is so deep in the woods that no sound could penetrate it, either coming out or going in. So here's this interesting question. How in the heck did Jane hear Rochester calling for her if he's in a place through which sound can't pass? In other words, this is kind of like a big question mark. Okay, all of that to say, you would never make sense of this novel except it had this weird deus ex machina, or when the God comes and solves the plot. Okay, so all of a sudden you had this weird moment where an impossible moment is solved miraculously. The reason Jane can hear Jane is because Ferndeen is not a geographical location. Ferndeen is a place where that people dwell in when their spirits have combined in a fertile way. In other words, Ferndeen is anywhere two spirits have married. You're not going to find it on a map. Now, this is an example. Ferndeen, what makes that interesting partly is that it relates to the word green, fern. In the very first early chapters at Gateshead, Jane, she says she is enchanted with books that have these little elf figures in them. That's also green. And what I'm trying to say is that you had ice and fire and green. And green is when the ice and the fire come together to be generative. Okay. That's a kind of genesis. The natural world, in other words, is only part of where human beings reside. We don't just live in nature. We take nature and turn it into culture. We don't live in trees. We take trees and turn them into houses. We don't live under stones. We take stones and make roads out of them. So you can say that the human world is part natural and part artificial, and that what creates the artificial world is the imagination. Okay, all of that to say that Ferndeen is any place where the imagination has wedded nature in such a way that nature is even more generative for the human spirit than it would be without the imagination participating in its completion. In other words, the imagination is participating in completing the natural world. This is really, really interesting stuff, including theologically. And keep in mind, Charlotte Bronte lived, her father was a pastor. He was a rector of the Church of England in Haworth. Okay. She ended up eventually marrying a parson who was under her father. So she married a minister. She was also absolutely absorbed. Her professor in Belgium, Constantine Hager, said that Charlotte Bronte was nourished by the Bible, that it was a source of food for her. So, and her father was, because he graduated from Cambridge, in their house in Haworth, within the library, this is just a historical fact, they had the most sophisticated journals circulating in Europe at the time, at least in English, that was coming through into their home. And these kids were reading those journals. Okay. Partly what they're reading is some of the most sophisticated theological stuff coming out of Germany. And around this time at the end, let's say, of the 18th century, what's going on in Germany is, in terms of theology, is something called higher criticism. And it was basically an awareness that the Bible was a remarkably edited final product, that it would have been put together through various patches from all kind of time periods, heavily edited, redacted, so that between two verses in the Bible, there could be 1,000 years difference in when they were actually written, but some subsequent editor put them together. Okay, the awareness of the Bible's human construction was becoming incontrovertible within German intellectual theological circle. Okay, Coleridge, who was deeply invested in this conversation, was translating what was going on in higher criticism in Germany over into English, into English-speaking countries, coming through Coleridge. Okay, all of that conversation was going through the journals that Charlotte Bronte is reading. Yeah, and when I say that she was deeply invested in what was going on theologically, I mean she was deeply invested because she's trying to figure out, okay, if this higher criticism stuff is true, then how is the Bible still the Word of God? And she completely never doubted that it was the Word of God, okay? But she had to figure out imaginatively how it could be both. So when I talk about the way the imagination completes the natural world, we're partly talking about from a Christian perspective. How is it that we arrive at something like the Garden of Eden here on earth when we have no ability to go back to what it was like? We can only go forward. How are we going to arrive at something in which man was at one with God, when man and woman were at one with each other, when man was at one with nature? In other words, the Garden of Eden gives a world where things are perfectly integrated. And that is the case until man and woman eat out of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As long as they were eating out of the tree of life, everything was integrated. They ate out of this other tree, and now all of the integration is disintegrated. So a big part of Christianity is, how do we get back to genuine integration in a way that one is not superior to the other? In other words, we can get back, we can form a structure, but it might not be too integrated. It might be because there's a master and a slave. So part of the story of Christianity is, how do you get back to where people were at one, but you can't take any easy solutions in which one person becomes subordinate to the other person? Okay, all of that to say, if you start to get that, then you start to get Ferndeen, because here was a place where two people wedded in such a perfect way that neither was subordinate to the other.
Interesting.
So Charlotte Bronte, in other words, she was imagining a theology that would be ahead of its time, even for this moment. She was imagining a way to read the Bible that would not cause you to deny your body or your natural passions, but rather would fulfill those. And she lived in a time period when for many men, like St. John Rivers, a woman needed, period, men and women needed to subordinate their natural passions in order to get to heaven when they died. This was not working for Charlotte Bronte. She saw right through that as a major head game that was related to people manipulating people. And so what I'm trying to say is, she was imagining a way to read the Bible that didn't lead to people being subordinated to this guy that sits on a throne up in the sky, that doesn't like you to do anything that's semi-sexual, and that will send you to hell if you do. That was not working for her.
And that kind of links us back to the Morphodite in To Kill a Mockingbird, right? And the whole caste.
Yeah. So in To Kill a Mockingbird, we talked about the opposite of a caste system is, how does a body of people come together to form a structure that is not exploitive? Because Jim sees that Macomb is like ancient Egypt in the sense that there's a caste system in Macomb, with the white people like the Finches at the top, then the Cunninghams, then the Yules, and then in the novel's terms, the Negroes. Jim saw that was the way they organized their body as a community. So the real question is, how do we organize our body as a community that isn't a pyramid? Mm-hmm. What other structure might it be? Well, this is exactly what Charlotte Bronte is working through. And you can imagine at a time period when women were really, the opportunities for a woman was to be a wife, a governess, or a teacher, or some combination, but that was the limits. Okay. And if you were going to, when Jane Eyre was published, one of the reviews said, if a man wrote this is brilliant. If a woman wrote it, it's diabolical. Now, that's a really interesting statement, because it's basically saying that a woman should not have these kinds of fiery feelings, right? Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that Charlotte Bronte was trying to imagine an understanding of the Bible in which you didn't have to commit violence to your own nature to arrive again at an integration with the natural world, other people, and a divine source. How can I be a whole person and a spiritual being? And I don't want to be a spiritual being if it means I'm not a whole person. And for someone to have the intellectual and imaginative chutzpah at her time to say, you know what, you guys are reading the Bible in a really twisted, manipulative way. And I'm about to give you a novel that, if you can participate in it, is about to reveal to you that there's another way to make sense of these kinds of theological realities that doesn't culminate in your reading of the Bible.
All right. So that is so many things. That's awesome.
It is awesome stuff. And to think a little enclave of children is at the time that the novel was written, two of her siblings had already died. And it may have been that Branwell had died by the time this was published, but I'm not sure Branwell's alive when this was published. But in any case, as little children, Charlotte and Branwell, that was her younger brother, Patrick, and they formed a little make-believe universe that it manifests itself in these little books. And Emily and Anne had their own little make-believe universe. And not only did these, and I mean, really, these were tiny little books not only did they have these books, they actually had journals on these books. Okay. This was an incredible intellectual universe, and it was all within their own little home environment. The other kids in the neighborhood, I was visited Haworth because it was just, I did one of my master thesis on this novel, and I wanted to go there. And at the Haworth, a part of the museum there's a little contribution from some of the neighbors' kids that one time the Bronte children came over for a birthday party, and they really didn't know how to play the way the other kids were playing. They were sort of like they were bamboozled by what these kids were doing, because the way they played was incredibly intellectually sophisticated and you could just say precocious. Because they were. My point is, it would be a great disservice to this novel to underestimate the conscious intelligence of Charlotte Bronte, but also the imaginative profundity. She's not just playing around with Gothic horror novels, let me assure you. And she's not spending her life with that kind of genius trying to give you a love story about a handsome, sort of semi-handsome, swarthy guy and a homely governess. Those things are only really interesting as they are symbols of something far more interesting.
Well, that's great. I've already started a list of things that I want to talk about in the future about this book. So that's perfect.
Right.
So
let me give you real quick another example of wordplay. Yeah. The family at Gateshead, what are their names? Their names are the Reeds, R-E-E-D. And what does the whole novel start with? With her retiring into this shrine on a rainy day, and picks up Bewick's Natural History of Birds. And pretty soon what happens is John Reed comes into the room and tells her not to read their books because she's a slave, and then proceeds to throw one of the books and hit her. In other words, he threw the book at her. Now, his last name is Reed. The whole chapter is about reading. So if that's a wordplay, you would complete. And if you think about it, it's obvious. Why are they named the Reeds? She could have named them anything. Well, here was John, this little John, not the St. John. This John was going to be a master reader. He was going to tell her how she was going to read and what she was going to read. And you know what she was saying? She punched him in the face. That's resisting all the way. Now, you don't think Charlotte Bronte is saying something at some level to all the men in her life, including pastors, who are going to tell her what she's going to read and not what she's going to read and how she's going to read it? I mean, this is sophisticated stuff, but guess what? It all went through a word, read, R-E-E-D. It's a homonym for read. If you're not paying attention, that'll just be the last name of some people in England.
Mm-hmm. Great. Good stuff. All right. So hopefully that gives people enough stuff to get started, to get reading that book. And one of the things that we've talked about in the first two podcasts were kind of book recommendations, and you had given a couple, and I wanted to share one because I'm curious, and I don't know how big your to be read pile is, but if you can maybe add this one to it, if you have it. The book is called The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. Okay. And I read this book a couple years ago, and she's got another one. Her first book was the Night Circus. And they're both really interesting, imaginative books. But the second one, The Starless Sea, was one of those that I read through and immediately got to the end and immediately started it back at the beginning again to read it again. And so this is one that the more you and I talk, the more I want to go back and read it again with some of these ideas in mind, because I have a feeling there's so much there that I missed, even though I've read it 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 times at this point, with that idea in mind that there's something else deeper there. And I think I knew there was something, but I was so distracted by this gorgeous plot and the visuals of it the first couple times. So So that is my recommendation this time.
Well, thank you. I'm going to check those books out. I've not heard of the author, but just out of the top of my head, when I hear those two titles, I'm paying attention to the words. So I see Starless Seed, and then the other's Night Circus. So I'm already thinking that for her, something to do with light and dark, in which the stars are a big element, and they somehow relate to something like the seed, which means from the highest part of the earth to the bottom of the earth. In other words, a star and a seed would create a vertical kind of axis. Now, I don't know if that's meaningful.
Yep.
But I know those titles are not haphazard selections. When an author picks titles, in some sense, the entire vision of the novel needs to be concentrated in the title. So if you just take Night Circus and Starless Seeds and start saying what's going on, you get insight into the way that Anne Morgenstern's imagination is working. And guess what? In some ways, and perhaps many, it'll intersect with the way other great authors, because here's what they have in common. The verbal universe has an integrity, and they're working with it. Just like two different mathematicians that work with numbers starts doing things that overlap with each other. Well, there's a reason, because they're working with numbers. Well, if you imagine that those letters have an integrity, different authors working with them are going to have unique things, but they're going to not be so unique that they don't intersect with what other people are doing with those words.
Great. Awesome. All right. So on that note, The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern.
C, not C.
C. Which works too. Yeah, I think so.
Bottom.
And Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte. We're going to be looking forward to the lecture and some more conversation. So thank you so much. And we will be looking forward to our next connection.
Excellent. Thank you so much, guys. And thanks to Austin, Minnesota, the library. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much.